If you guys have any questions, just raise up your hand as I go through these slides. I added some cool things that I think will help you guys memorize what happens in Acts, because I know it's like a ton of chapters. But I brought some like cool little things in there and some like funny jokes, so it'll like stick in your guys' head. But you guys have any questions, just let me know. So before we go into what occurs in each chapter of Acts, we're gonna Luke, the author of Acts, gives a comparison between Peter and Paul. I'm sure as Dr. Grant's told you that Acts isn't about the story of Paul and about Paul solely. It's about the church and how the Holy Spirit is working through the book of Acts. The main character would be honestly the Holy Spirit and intervening and doing the miracles, working through the disciples and the apostles. But Paul and Peter are the main protagonists, as Paul is the main protagonist from the later half of the book of Acts. You see parallels between them. So they both perform signs and wonders. They both raise someone from the dead. They both rebuke demons, which you'll see later on that occurs. And they both are free from prison chains. But there is a difference in terms of the prison chains. Paul chooses to stay in prison when it occurs to him in Acts 16, while Peter is escorted out by an angel, which I'm sure you guys already covered that. From this, we have Paul's ministry. So it's separated into three main missions. This is important, so if you guys want to take note on what these missions are. So the first one is that it's his shortest journey around Asia. It's his first mission from 13 to 14. On this trip, which you will see who his companions were, he's with Barnabas. And then the next missionary trip is from Asia Minor to Macedonia to Greece. That's one of my favorite chapters because I myself, I'm an apologist. So if you guys like apologetics, I love that stuff. So Paul goes over there and he does apologetics, especially in Athens. So we'll touch on that. And the third journey is in Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. It ends with Paul from Ephesians going back to Jerusalem. And then from Jerusalem to Rome, it's not necessarily a missionary journey. It's more of his way ending up in Rome because he gets tried and he gets arrested. And his base of operations is in the church of Antioch. So Antioch is kind of like where he goes. So he'll come back there, meet with the church, build up information, how's things going, what are the finances of the church needs, and then he'll spread out from there. Paul methods usually follow two steps. You see this like in Romans 1:16, I believe, or it's Romans, if you could correct me, Dr. Grant. It's first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. Paul makes it explicit in his letter in Romans. And there's the understanding of this that Paul went out to the synagogues first. And there's different ways of understanding why did he go to the Jews first. One of it's like the covenant law was for the Israelites were the chosen. But it's not necessarily only that, is that the synagogues were the place where you would start. So if I'm going to build a church somewhere, I'm going to go to the synagogue. From the synagogue, I tell them about the gospel, I tell them about who Christ is, they get saved. So as I go around the city, around the marketplace, and proclaiming the gospel to others, they're able to have a base of operations for the church to start growing. And then from there, you would have Gentiles. And during this time, Gentiles were getting converted. So when Paul was speaking to Jews, let's say he was speaking specifically to Jews, and if a Gentile overheard, it doesn't mean that he neglected them and then went only to the Jews. They tend to accept. And you'll see that as we continue from here. So his companions. Paul was not a lone ranger in his ministry, except for one time. Only one time he was only alone. And that's in Athens, when he debates in the Areopagus. But most of the time, all the time actually, other than that, he's not alone. He has Barnabas, who's with him with the first journey from Acts chapter 13 to Acts chapter 14. John Mark is also with him. There's a dispute between Paul and Barnabas, which I'll explain what occurs between that dispute, but it's over John Mark. Silas goes with him. Timothy comes with Paul from the second missionary journey on forward. And Titus as well. It's from there forward. And Luke also I believe he's in between when they meet with Timothy and Titus. Luke then gets involved into the story. And then you have Priscilla and Aquila, who are other members of the church. It was a married couple. And the cool thing about Luke is that when he uplifts the women in the culture, and he shows you that in that time period, it wasn't necessarily misogynistic towards women. That's kind of like a misconsensus on that. In that time culture, women were put down. That's not true, because later on he meets a lady named Lydia, who was a businesswoman who sold fabric of purple die, and it's very expensive to have it. Jesus had a robe of that. That's what they cast lots for when he was being crucified. So you'll see that Luke heightens and gives credit to women to the women in ministry and how they supported the church and how they provided funds. And they even invited people to their own homes to come congregate and worship God as well. So these are the main people. If you guys want to write that down, just because that's important, so you know who was with Paul during his journey. You guys got that? Any questions? Okay, cool. Okay, so his first missionary journey. This, as I said, it's the shortest missionary journey. Paul travels with Barnabas. John Mark is the nephew of Barnabas, and what they do is, of course, they go to the synagogue first. They go to the Jews, and then they go to the Gentiles, and their methods work really well. On this map, let me go to the next slide so I could just show you. I think, is it the slide before there was a map? Sorry. So you could see, because it helps with observations, you could see. So Antioch is right here. So it goes from here. They go to Cyprus. They go to Paphos. They began their ministry here. There's a proconsul, Sergius Palace. That's where this guy wants to hear more about God. He's a God-fearing man. And when he's there, there's a sorcerer named Bar Jesus, which is his Elemius, which translates to sorcerer. And he's, causing strife. He's just causing an issue for Paul. So then Paul rebukes him, and he gets blind. And then he goes around touching people, acting like he can't see. And well, he couldn't see because he was blind. And the people saw this. Some people grew a faith. Some people gave into the faith. And the proconsul gets saved. So he gets saved. They go from here, and then they head up to Altia, to Pisidia, to Iconium. Sorry, guys. And the Derbe. During his travels here, they start facing their first oppression against Jewish leaders and groups. And one of their cases is that Barnabas and Paul get beaten up pretty bad. Paul gets stoned nearly to death, but he survives. And when this occurs, of course, there's a lot of distress within their group. And it happens with John Mark, which I'll explain to you why that's significant in that area. But he continues his journey. And then the arrows going back and forth is that Paul, during these chapters, he's going back to the churches to strengthen them, encourage them, build up the faith, and make sure that everything is running well with that. So let me go back to... okay, and then this leads to what happens in Acts 15. This is very important. This is called the Jerusalem Council. So the Jerusalem Council, because of their success in this first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas realized that many Gentiles are converting to the faith. And they're excited about this. They're reporting back to the church of this news. And there's these Judaizers who complain that they're not really Christians because they're not following the Mosaic law and they're not circumcised. So there's a dispute between Paul and them. And again, remember, Paul is like a Pharisee of Pharisees. So he knows his Torah, the Tanakh. He knows it very, very well. So they go back, they go to the church, I believe with Peter, and then they discuss, okay, how do we resolve this issue? And they come to this conclusion that we're under the covenant of grace now, and the grace is what leads to salvation. And again, Paul is not dismissing the significance of the Mosaic law. Paul himself is a devout Jew. Throughout, when we'll continue, you'll see that Paul takes on practices that are still of the Jewish culture. He'll take on a Nazarite vow where he shaves his head, and I'll explain what that means later. But they came together and they came to this conclusion that they write a letter to the church to encourage and help the Gentiles who feel maybe discriminated or left out from the covenant. So therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. Now, this is following the Mosaic law. You're not supposed to the Ten Commandments. You're not having any other gods before me. That's the obvious one. Sexual immorality, the idea of do not have sex outside of the bounds of marriage between a husband and wife. And the things from strangled and from blood. What do you guys think strangled and blood means from? What do you think that means? Why strangled and blood? Does anyone have any idea? Any guess? Anyone? Okay. So the idea of a strangled has to do in the Jewish customs when they would kill the animals for sacrifice. During like Aaron, when he would do it for the people of Israel, they would cut the throat. It was inhumane to strangle the animal because in Genesis, God breathes life. The breath is I believe is the rahuk, which is the breath that's in our lives. So to strangle it is to deprive it of its life is essential. So it's considered inhumane, but also not part of the Jewish tradition. By blood, it doesn't mean that, oh, if you cut their throat, of course blood's going to come out. What they would do, the Gentiles, is that the idea was consuming blood or pollution with the blood. So that's what they're supposed to abstain from. So it's abstain from foreign gods, worshiping other gods, sexual immorality, and from sacrificing strangled or the drinking of consuming blood. And the thing that's pretty interesting that Luke adds is that for Moses has had throughout many generations, for those preached to him in every city, being read in every synagogue, every Sabbath. So when this letter was being sent, it would have been understood by them, like why we're abstaining from these things, why we're understanding. It's not something that comes out of like, what's the explanation from this? They have the explanation because Moses was taught. So it's interesting that Luke adds that details to give you context of this geographical area. Okay, so now we go into the second missionary journey. So the second missionary journey is, like I said previous, it's one of my favorites just because it has apologetics in it. In Acts 15 to Acts 18, they come to the conclusion from the Jerusalem Council what to abstain from. Gentiles are part of the new covenant. Of course, this goes inside with Peter, I think in Acts 10, that the Gentiles are entered into the new covenant. There's a disagreement now, because now there's like Barnabas and Paul, like, okay, now let's go out and continue with our mission. Let's go proclaim the gospel. During this time, though, they became a disagreement over John Mark, because John Mark had fled from the mission when they were being persecuted. He had like abandoned the call. So Paul doesn't believe that John Mark is fit for spreading the gospel, and Barnabas, you could say, is wanting to give a second chance, or maybe because he's tied to him because it's his nephew, so he may have bias, you could say, to bring him along. Now, the level of degrees of how Paul views John Mark, it could be from like heretical, that he thinks that John Mark is just not legit, or it could just be like he's not ready yet for the mission, but maybe later on he could be ready for the mission, or he just doesn't believe that he's called for this ministry, for this part. So there's disputes over exactly what was the exact reason for Paul going against the bringing of John Mark. So this is when they separate. So Barnabas is no longer with Paul. Paul then takes on Silas. And they head to Syria, and Barnabas heads down back to Cyprus from the first missionary journey, one of the first places they visited. Paul's second journey is a lot longer than the first one. So on this journey, so before I go into this, so I could just show you the map. Okay, so Barnabas go here with John Mark. Paul goes up all the way here from Antioch, Sicilia. He comes up. This is where he meets Timothy. Timothy was a Gentile Jewish. His mother was Jewish, but his father was a Gentile. And Paul circumcises Timothy. And one of the reasons for circumcising him was that so when they engage with Jews and bring them to the synagogue, it doesn't conflict and have issues with the Jews and not accepting of Timothy. And you're probably wondering, like, how do they know whether someone was circumcised? There's like bathhouses. So they would have just, a person being nosy, looked, saw, and if someone walked into a synagogue that was not circumcised, they would have complained. So that's like one idea of the reason why it was a way to protect themselves for Timothy. So then Paul takes Timothy, becomes a Christian. They come up all the way up here. Paul receives a message, a vision to encourage him to go to Macedonia, which is over here, Macedonia up here. While he's on this way, Luke joins at Neapolis with Paul, and Paul gets in prison. But as he's heading here, he runs into this person who becomes the very first European Christian, and her name is Lydia of Thyatira. Lydia, like I said it before, was a very successful businesswoman who'd sold expensive purple cloth, a luxury item that was associated with royalty, nobility. Luke is drawing a comparison. Again, Christ with his robe. They cost lots for it. It was very wealthy. Lydia was from the city of Thyatira, which was famous for its purple cloth, like I just said. her family. So when she welcomes Paul and she welcomes him into hospitality with her family, um, her whole family gets saved. They all get baptized, and her home becomes like one of a church to welcome people to come in and worship God. So she becomes one of a prominent a person into the faith as she's hosting people, she's leading it, and she's a businesswoman. So she provides, as possible as she provided financial support for the church on their journeys, because it's a very expensive. Travel long distances to eat, to house people of large numbers, to provide shelter, and yeah, she was considered part of that. And this goes in Philippi. So from there, we got from John Luke. Then Paul gets imprisoned. So let's go to that. I think that's my next slide. Yeah. So Paul gets imprisoned. What occurs is that Paul is speaking, proclaiming the gospel, and there's this woman who's possessed by a spirit, and she's saying things that are true. She says, "This is the man speaking about God, speaking about Christ," but it's not a good thing in the way she's saying it. And she's doing it to mock and be a hindrance unto Paul's ministry. Paul gets annoyed and rebukes the spirit out of her, and she gets saved. But the interesting thing when you read in Acts 16 is that in Acts 16, it tells you that the people that were making money off of her were greatly upset and troubled, which is sad. So people, like even today, you see people who make money or they benefit from the suffering of others. And you see this evil. And I would even question that woman that was possessed, I wouldn't say that she was inherently evil. I would say that the men feeding off of her pain and suffering and using to exploit her are more inherently corrupt than she was, even though she was possessed. They externally look good, but internally they were corrupt. So they get upset. They accuse Paul of lies. The people rebel against him. Paul doesn't say anything. It's not explicit in the text that he says anything. We don't know if he did or didn't, but from the text he doesn't say anything. So Paul and Silas get beat up pretty bad. They get whipped. They get flogged. The cool thing is they get fastened to stocks. And Dr. Grant told me this, and I thought it was pretty cool. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Grant, if I heard this wrong. But that's the Greek word down there is for stock. It only appears twice in the New Testament, correct? It's stuck. A few more times? Okay. And it's associated to like cross, or Jesus being on the cross to the wood, to the tree. And it's pretty cool because it's the parallels of Paul's and Silas being beaten, being flogged, being unjustly tried, being thrown into prison, going to the innermost part of the prison. So think of it like symbolic of hell, right? Paul's symbol is parallel to Christ, being mistreated, unjustly tried, beaten, killed, and then Christ dies and goes to hell. So it's cool to see that parallelism between Paul and Silas. While Paul and Silas, I put that picture over there, they start proclaiming the gospel. They start singing. Everyone in the prison cells could hear it. Even the prison guard could hear it. And then, the event happens. A big earthquake occurs. The gates all open. The chains are free. And the Roman soldier, because it was, if anyone is released from duty, if anyone flees from duty while you're on duty, if anyone flees while you're on duty, it's punishable by death. And it's also a great dishonor towards your name and possibly your household. So he's about to kill himself, but then Paul and Silas call out to him and they tell him not to. We have stayed. I was a young Christian, and I heard this story. I always assumed that it was only Paul and Silas who stayed. But in the scripture, it says we all stayed. Like, we're here. We haven't left. It's likely that even the prisoners stayed with Paul and Silas there, meaning that Paul and Silas's work of proclaiming the gospel, singing, even possibly evangelize those around him, that they stayed and waited for the person. They're the person that the prisoners would hate, someone that's holding them hostage, and they stayed. So it's very powerful, and it's very moving. I just assumed that it was just those two, but it was possibly that everyone stayed there. Of course, he gets saved, he goes, brings him to his family, everyone gets saved. Then the next day, the officials tell him to get rid of those people, and Paul says, he invokes his Roman citizenship. So Saul's is Hebrew, Paul would be like his Roman name. And they freak out, because, oh my God, we just beat up a Roman citizen. A Roman citizen, especially by birth, was a significant person. They're high in the hierarchical, I guess you could say, pyramid of people who representation. So to do that was a major offense, punishable by death or harsh treatment towards those who do that to him. They beg Paul to leave quietly and we'll let you go and we're so sorry, pretty much. But Paul doesn't leave right away. They go back to Lydia, to her home, and they encourage with the gospel. They tell them, what to prepare for, what to look next for, and they leave on to their next missionary trip. Okay, so before I get to that one, so they go from there to Philippi, and then they come up to Athens. They go to Thessalonica. Paul goes to Thessalonica first. He meets with the church. He establishes the church. You get those letters first, Thessalonians, and he also goes to Berea too. During that time, though, there's this Jewish occupation that's growing up that's revolting against Paul, and they seem to be following him. And you see that these guys will follow Paul all the way to Acts 21, all the way to Jerusalem. So these guys have like a vendetta against Paul. But it starts right over here, right in this area, because these guys have a big beef with him. So from there, after this, Paul gets alone. This is the only time in his missionary church journey that Paul's alone. And I put a picture of Cliff Mitchell. Do you guys know who Cliff Mitchell is? He's the Apologetic. He's like all over TikTok. He goes to college universities, and he preaches the gospel, but he debates, atheists, agnostic, all those type. I put that as an example to help ingrain in your brain, so you can have an idea. This is like Paul is doing a similar thing in Athens. So Athens, this is probably my favorite chapter in Acts. So Paul heads to Athens. As he heads to Athens, he's moved by the Spirit. He groans in the Spirit because he's disgusted by all these idols that are throughout the city. And these idols, he feels moved in the Spirit to proclaim the gospel here. So he goes to the synagogues first, following again, emphasis on that. He goes to the synagogues, tells them about the gospel, and then he goes into the marketplace. To give you some context of what Athens is, Athens back in the day would be like the highest academia back in the day. So Alexandria was the top school. The second one would have been Ephesus and Ephesians, were the top schools in the world. Think of like Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard. This is that type of level. Luke is going to show you that Paul is very educated. He's very smart. And he's very good at his rhetoric, and he's very good at his logic. And Luke draws a comparison between Socrates and Paul. If you guys ever read the Apology in philosophy, Socrates is put on trial for 3 crimes that are similar to what Paul then goes in issue with in the Apologetic, but they both have 2 different results. Paul lives and converts them. Socrates gets killed. So it's a cool little show right there. So what does he say about this unknown God? So there's a statue in the Areopagus. So he's in the marketplace. They like what he say. The Stoic philosophers, Epicurean philosophers hear him. I originally thought that they liked what he said and they bring him to the Areopagus. But then when I was in Dr. Grenz's class and we were reading Willington, actually it's more likely that they necessarily either some of them didn't like or they were like found issue and they want to bring him to like the top guys pretty much, the high Athenian council, to hear what he's saying as a dispute, as a trial of what he's saying. So he's not in a sense like in prison trial, but in a sense that he's being judged by what he's talking about. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That's why he draws a comparison to Socrates, because Socrates was put in the same dilemma. So, Agnosio Theos. So he's in there in the Areopagus. He points to this unknown statue. I've looked at all your statues, but there's this one statue that he's fond of, that he likes versus the other ones. And it says Agnosio Theos. Agnosio, it just literally means the unknown God. It's where it's a Greek word for agnostic. So if anyone says I'm agnostic, it means that they believe in a God, but they don't have an identity of who that God is. It comes from that. So I put this verse up there to give you an idea of what's going on. So then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, perceive that in all things you are very religious. For I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, sonship. I haven't found an altar with the inscription, the unknown God. Therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. So again, Paul isn't discrediting the Athenian culture. He's accrediting their religious beliefs. He acknowledges that they're very intelligent. They've done great things. Like these are mathematicians. These are philosophers. These are astronomers. He's not disregarding their truth. He's disregarding what they have their belief in. And he makes a critique on their philosophy as well. Because they're thinkers, but then how can you put God and create him out of stone? If he's all powerful, why is a stone significant for power? It is a contradiction. Like you made God into your own hands. You made him in your own idolship. God is not that being. So then Paul does a cool thing as he's talking with them. Oh, I should touch on this first. Previous to this, Paul, when he gives his lectures or when he gives his talks with people, he refers to the Abrahamic cultures. You go from Abraham to Moses to the prophets. Paul doesn't do that in Athens because it wouldn't be significant to them because they wouldn't even care about that. So he appeals to them through their philosophy. And a lot of people don't know this, that Paul uses sources outside of the Bible to support his claims, which is pretty cool. And he quotes Epimenides, who was a philosopher 600 years ago, a poet. And it says, "For in him we live and move and have our being. As also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring." The significance of this, I'll go into that, is he's giving an identity to who God is. God is all-powerful, God is a creator, and God is life-giving. God is in control of history. And who this God is Jesus Christ, and he rose from the dead. So he's making a connection to them. Your poets are right on what they said. Now, let me identify who that Christ is. So he's drawing to attention, they're thinking, they're digesting what he's saying, but then he gets this type of response. And there's disputes on why he gets this type of response. Some join, some don't. Some said that you had me, the verse says, you had me until resurrection. So in the Greek culture, anastasis is the Greek word for resurrection, but it also refers to a goddess. In Acts 17:18, when they're first hearing Paul speak, and they asked us, a guy asked, maybe a Stoic philosopher asked, an Epicurean philosopher, like, what's this guy teaching about? And he says, this blabbler is speaking of many gods. Paul never talked about many gods. He talks about one God. So what they got confused is that when they said Jesus and resurrection, they're thinking Jesus and this female goddess. So that's what confused them. And that's what they found. And then what they thought was a ridiculous idea. I'm not going to go into full detail on this just for time, but just to give you an overview, you have Epicureanism and Stoicism. Epicureanism is a philosophy of the greatest pleasure. The virtue is pleasure. The worst thing is pain. And they were materialists. So their metaphysics is materials. There's no such thing as an afterlife. There is no such thing as a soul. Everything is made up of atoms, which is pretty interesting because we know everything's made up of atoms and small molecules. So it's pretty cool that 2,300 years ago, they had that part right. But to them, it was ridiculous to them because, like, what do you mean an afterlife? What do you mean a body could be raised from dead? The Stoics added that the Stoics would have been more acquainted with Paul, but Paul makes criticism of both of them. Stoics are very heavily influenced by virtue, justice, temperance, prudence, courage. Those are things that you read in the Gospels. That's the thing that you read in the Bible. Faith, hope, and love. I have called you to be courageous, right, in Joshua 1:9. Those are things that a Stoic would be like, yeah, I agree with those things. And they also believed in a logos, but they didn't believe in a fully divine, autonomous logos. Autonomous just means acting free will, like the way I'm acting right now. It was more just they were pantheists, so it was more just a thing. And the logos is what's in John in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. That's Jesus. So Paul is making a connection to the logos, to Jesus. But they would have issue with the idea of the resurrection because of similar issues, and as they were pantheists as well. So from this, the last thing I'll say about this is that with Paul, he converts some. One of them was Dionysius, who was a leader of the Areopagus Council. So it shows you the thinking, the thought. There's dialogue between them. My personal belief, but there's theologians who disagree on this, is that the verses that give the dialogue doesn't say who says this, but they're kind of sarcastic and rude. I believe that's the Epicureans. And the ones that are more like, I'm curious to hear more of what you're saying. This sounds interesting, I believe are the Stoics. I could see that. Then a counter argument against me is that actually both of them are being sarcastic in those remarks. But I tend to think that the other remark is a little bit more optimistic. Okay, this is the third missionary journey. So this is Acts 18 to Acts 20. This one's pretty cool. So in Athens, Paul shows that Christianity is aligned in truth with education, with understanding, but you have to correct some issues that they had in terms of who God is and how Christianity even dominates. So Paul succeeds where Socrates, you would say, quote unquote, failed in moving the people. And Acts 18 and 20, it's now showing that Christianity is superior to the demonic, superior to evil, superior to witchcraft. And you see that what happens in Ephesus. So again, Paul is still in the area of philosophers and thinkers, but he's also, when he goes to Corinthians, you guys are familiar with the letter of Corinthians, right? Like that's like a very harsh letter that people would say towards Corinthians, and it's because of the lifestyles that they lived and they believed. He comes into a conflict with the local pagans. Galileo was a leader. Sosthenes accuses Paul of things. Go up to Galileo. Galileo says, before Paul could give a defense against Sosthenes, Galileo says, this is not important to me. This has to do with your law. Deal with it yourselves. The crowd gets so upset that they beat up Sosthenes. So the guy that went up to accuse Paul gets beaten up by his own people, by his own friends. It'd be like if your own homie started just jumping on you and beating you up, which is crazy. But I think it's really funny. Also, Paul takes a Nazarite vow there when he shaves his head. They meet. Priscilla and Aquila introduces Paul to Apollos, who knew the Old Testament. Then he gets baptized and becomes a Christian. Now, this is pretty cool. Acts 19, I think, is another part of my favorite verses. So Paul demonstrates miracles, illustrates the superiority of Christianity over the demonic. So Paul's handkerchiefs were put out, and people would touch them, they would be healed. There's a story of these guys. I forget the son of someone. Sons of Sceva, thank you. And they see the power of Paul, but they're not willing to accept Christ as Lord and Savior. So they just believe the power is in Paul and not from God. So then they come to this demon-possessed person, and they say this, I think it's funny. We rebuke you in the name of Jesus that Paul preaches about. See, it's not like, I'm not associated to God. I'm not in relation with God. He's not my heavenly Father. It's Paul's God. The demon responds back to him, Paul I know, Jesus I know, but who are you? Meaning they had no authority. And then the demon jumps them. They get beaten up so bad they come out naked because they ripped their clothes and they're freaking out. The people in the city see this and they're astonished by what happened and what has occurred, that even these religious leaders who they thought were significant and true or aligned with God were not, and Paul was. And what happens is that there was a whole bunch of these magic books. There was like the capital of witchcraft and all these things. And the city then starts putting these pile of all these books, and they start burning these books. So 50,000 drachmas is 135 years of wages. That's how much. That's how many books will burn and how much it costs. So imagine working for 135 years of wages was equivalent to the value of books that they had. It just shows you the power of Christianity, the way it's victory over sickness, disease, demonic, evil, vanity, all that. It's awesome. So the spirit of Christianity then also goes, so he attacks the demonic, and then he attacks corrupt business type. And I reference again, like in Acts 16, those people who are making money off of the suffering of that girl. There's another situation where there's this guy named Demetrius. He's a silversmith. He makes these idols of Artemis or Diana, and he's upset because he's losing business because he just saw everyone just burn all these books, and people are throwing away all their gods. He would make money from making and mass producing these gods, right? Imagine someone like a vendor telling you, hey, if you buy this crystal ball, the man of your dreams will come real, or the girl of your dreams will come, and people bought into that. Like, I'm just using it as an example. Now that's being shown as a lie and a fallacy, they're just throwing him away, and he's hurt, so he's upset. So then he bands up the people who worshipped Artemis, because Artemis was like their god, their central figure, and they get all upset. He starts an uproar in the city, and they start shouting, I think it's like 2 to 3 hours, all hail the goddess Diana, all hail the goddess Diana, over and over again. People try to stop him, they rebuke him. Paul speaks with them, and then a leader confronts these people and tells them to stop what you're doing, because what you're doing is going to cause an issue with Rome, and if they find out, we're going to be all suffering from the pain. So they all disperse. So it shows you that Christianity even affected corrupt business, corrupt enterprises that were working in the world. So you see how it's not just the gospel being preached and healing people from sickness, but it's also correcting governments, correcting business corporations, correcting lifestyles, cultures that are not aligned with godliness. Paul then gets, so after this, Paul finds a final mission this is his final mission before he gets arrested. How much time do I got left? I got 11 minutes? Okay, I'll hurry this up through. So Paul in Acts 20, before Acts 20, there's this guy, Paul gives like his longest speech. Paul talks for like 9 hours or like 8 or 10 hours. I can't imagine talking for 8 or 9 hours. There's a guy named Eutychus, Eutychus, and he falls asleep and he falls from the window. Everyone's like, oh my God, this guy just died. Paul goes up to him, raises him back from the dead, and goes back to preaching for another several hours. Like if nothing. And everyone is just like, so imagine, this is how I visualize it. I don't think he was the only one falling asleep. Maybe there were some other people falling asleep. Boom, the guy dies. Everyone wakes up, right? And they're freaking out. Paul raises them back from the life, goes back to preaching. Now everyone is tuned and focused because they just saw someone die and come back from the life. So it's like, whoa, okay, I gotta stay awake for this. I think that's pretty funny. But then he leaves Ephesus and it mourns people because he stayed there long. He stayed there for like 2.5 years, 2 to 3 months. And people mourn for him. They don't want Paul to leave. Paul is heading back to Jerusalem for financial support for the church. And I believe he takes a Nazarite vow after this too. And they're just mourning. And of course, during this time, as he's on his way to Jerusalem, he gets a prophetess warns him that you're going to be bound. She puts like rope around his hand. This is going to happen to you when you enter Jerusalem. And he says, it's for me to go spread the gospel, even if it costs my life. Jesus declared me to go over there. And of course, this is repeated because Christ promised to Paul in the beginning when he first conversions, and then it happens later on, that he will spread the gospels from governors to from leaders to governors to kings. And that's what happens to Paul from here. Man, I gotta hurry up. Okay. This is a lot. It's so hard to cram all this like in one thing. Honestly, each chapter you could do a whole class on it. So he goes from here, travels up. This is his third missionary journey, so what we just saw from before. Paul establishes 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. Paul restores the life of young Eutychus, a guy who fell off. Paul's going back and forth, strengthening the church, building it up, like with Ephesians. Comes to Athens, revisits the church, and then he's revisits the church with the Corinthians, comes back, and then from here he goes all the way back this way and heads back to Jerusalem. During this time, as he's in Jerusalem, so Paul gets a trouble again, and I believe it's the same Jews all the way from Acts 17 that follow him and are just hating against him, that they just want to get rid of Paul, and they accuse him of bringing a Gentile to the temple. Paul meets some Gentiles before this, but he does ritual cleansing with them. Paul will not break the Jewish tradition. He's too knowledgeable and he has too much respect from it, so he's not that type of person to do that. What more likely would happen is that they just saw him with Gentiles outside the temple, and then when he was in the temple, they assumed that he brought a Gentile inside the temple. So it's based off of assumption. All these accusations are assumptions or lies. They don't inherit truth. There's no inherent truth in them. So they start beating up on Paul. This commander sees what's going on. He's on a high tower. Lysias, he commands him to stop. He asks what the heck is going on. Paul speaks to him in Greek, and the guy's surprised. You speak Greek? I thought you were this Egyptian guy. And the reason why he's an Egyptian guy, quick, there was a warlord Egyptian guy that caused issues with Rome. They just assumed it was him. If you want more questions about that, you could ask me afterwards. So while he's there, he tells everyone, okay, we got to get going. Paul asks, can I speak? He speaks to the Jews. He mentions the resurrection. They get an uproar. He's about to flog Paul, but then Paul says, is it lawful for you to flog a Roman citizen? The guy finds out, you're a Roman citizen. Well, I bought my citizenship with a large amount of money. And a lot of people have the consensus, I thought all Roman soldiers were Roman citizens. That's not true. Some of them were, but it was usually the richer. And the richer ones because they bought it, or the higher commanders were born into it. Paul responds back, I was born as a citizen from Tarsus. So Paul, a Roman commander who bought his citizenship, was superior than a Roman commander in terms of his legitness, like being legit. So anyway, from Acts 21 all the way to I think Acts 24, 25, he goes from Lysias, who then sends him to Felix. The reason why he sends him to Felix is because there was the band, these Jews that hate Paul so much, take a vow that they're not going to they're not going to eat. There's fasting until we kill Paul. And Paul's nephew warns the commander about the assassination attempt. Lysias then says, don't tell anyone. He sends a letter to Felix. I'm sending you this man, and I protected him. Tells him the details of what occurred. He gets to Felix. Felix meets Paul. He says he's procrastinating. He's a lousy governor. And he just says, I'll just wait until Lysias comes back. and then he keeps Paul in a praetorium, which is like you could just call it a jail cell. But he was free to do stuff around, and he would meet with him often, but not just to hear about the gospel. He was hoping that Paul would receive money from his friends and that he could exploit Paul for money. But unfortunately, all he heard was the gospel, so he didn't get what he wanted. Felix then gets replaced by Festus, and Festus puts Paul into prison. He locks him up, he bounds him. Festus then meets with Agrippa because he's like, man, so Festus says, I'll just send you back to the Jews, and then Paul appeals to Caesar. And so now he has to, he revokes his Roman citizenship again, and he says, I'm appealing to Caesar. Because if Paul didn't, the assumption is that Paul could have been killed by the Jews, by the Jews that were after him. So then Festus asks his friend Agrippa, who is visiting him, who's a king, hey, I need some help. I'm not here to convict this guy. I just need to write a good letter to give an explanation why I'm sending this guy to Rome. Because if I don't, they're going to, cap back at me that I'm sending up someone up there without an explanation. So Paul gives his defense. Paul gives an explanation. Man, we don't have that much time. I wanted to go over this, but I'll go over this another time. This one's pretty interesting too. This is the third time, I just say this, the third time there's an addition about Saul, why are you persecuting me, kicking yourself against, you kick against the goads. That has to do with the idea of Paul's, when he was first called into ministry, that he's kicking against God's will. It's like, there's no point. It's futile what you're doing. You're going to proclaim the gospel, or it's that the gospel is going to keep on going regardless of what you do. No matter how many times when you was Saul killing people, no matter what you do, the gospel is going to be proclaimed to all the ends of the earth. And Jesus makes a promise to Paul, comforting him, Paul, I will protect you, and you will preach it to everyone, to leaders and to the emperor. So then Paul is brought to Rome. He makes his appeal to Caesar, as we just said. He gets in a boat ride. He's shipwrecked on an island of Malta. So he goes over here. So he gets to Fair Havens. They don't stay in Fair Havens because Fair Havens was a port that was made to survive the winter. So Paul advises them not to go, but the guy just ignores Paul and listens to the shipmaster. They were supposed to go to Phoenix. Look at this distance. They were supposed to go this distance. They don't listen to Paul. A wind takes them all the way over here, and they get lost for 14 days. And then there's a storm trouble. They want to kill. Paul calls out to them, an angel came to me, told me that all of you will live if you listen to what I say, not one of you die. They shipwreck on this little island, Malta. They survive. And I put this up there because I think it's kind of funny. So Paul is up there. He gets like a batch of wood sticks, and a snake is in there, and the snake bites him. And there was natives on that island. And they assumed, because he was a prisoner transport, like, oh, this guy must have been a very bad criminal. The gods are judging him for death. Paul just shakes off the snake and just throws it in the fire, and he lives. Then they're like, oh my God, this guy is God. This guy is Zeus. They assume that he's Zeus. So I thought it was kind of funny if you guys into the Chuck Norris joke. Like, Chuck Norris was once bitten by a snake, and after 3 days of agonizing pain, the snake died. So I think that's a little funny. I say like Paul is like Chuck Norris in that sense. The guy went through everything. I was boiled, beaten, flogged, but it doesn't bother him. Okay, this is the last slide. Whew, barely got 3 minutes left, guys. All right, so the story of Acts ends with Paul in house arrest. He is responsible for his own expenses. He's free to do things, but he's not able to go, like he can't just leave. He's under house arrest. He has a Roman centurion that's sent to guard him, and it's implied that the Roman centurion has been kind to him as the other centurions that he was with on Malta was kind to him too. He proclaims the gospel through all the kingdom. He's bound, but the ending of Acts, because people were like, it just ends. I want to know what happens to Paul. What happens to him afterwards? What happens when he speaks to the emperor? How come that's not recorded? And that's because it's not a story about Paul. It's a story of the work of the church and how it's being spread to all the ends of the earth. You start from Jerusalem now to all the ends of the earth, right? And then, of course, today we're all over the world now. And it was preached with all boldness and without hindrance. And today, like I think this is kind of like conviction for ourselves, is that especially as Christians, we tend to be fearful or timid to talk about God, when the apostles and the early church members had boldness to preach about God and love and kind respect, of course, and without hindrance, meaning that nothing stopped it, nothing hindered the church from proclaiming the gospel and going out throughout the world. And this is how Acts concludes with Paul. And of course, we know Paul is martyred. Later on, he gets killed, but God's promise to him that he would speak to all these leaders is fulfilled. Paul makes it all through. Paul provides so much for our church today. People study apologetics by looking at Acts 17. People look at Paul's dialogue, his rhetoric. For the Jew, I spoke as a Jew. For the Gentile, I spoke as a Gentile. You see his knowledge, his education, and you see the significance of who Paul is and what he's done for the church and how the church grows from here. But I think that's it. All right. Thank you guys.